as we get into it, I guess I want to give an introduction. Um, on the call, we have Dustin Gibson, who is, I don't know, a pretty cool person, disability justice advocate. He does a lot of work, like a whole range of work, and he connects it like in a really intersectional way, talking about prisons, talking about like schools, and policy and like where all the things came from, really. Um, yeah, and he's also like a big person in Pittsburgh who's been around for like a lot of the most pivotal moments in like recent Black history. Um, so yeah, and he also led 2 workshops that we've had with PSPN on Blackness and disability, one in Indiana and one in Pittsburgh. And we might have people who were a part of that who are on the call. We'll hear from them later on. But yeah, that's our call. So without much more, I'm gonna throw it to Dustin. Thank you for being on the call.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I think I see like some of the IUP cats. I could be wrong. Yeah, what's up? I knew I recognized. I'm looking at Justin as I say that, whose name gets mixed up with mine. Okay, cool. Like I'm also a little bit scattered today. Like I missed the train coming back from New York. So yeah, there's that. I want to like say that, and also like I guess like I know that we only have like 30 minutes, but I do want to end this kind of like I guess exhibit like some of the practices that some of the practices of disability justice and how that could be intertwined in all areas of the work that we do. Disability justice is not something that is solely focused on the liberation of disabled people, but more so collective liberation. And I believe that in practicing disability justice, it's one of the tools that we could utilize for collective liberation. And I'll kind of explain that. But one of the important things is like to understand that like this happens like in the lineage of something, that there's a history and we're standing on the shoulders of people. One of the things I was thinking a lot about today was Deborah Danner. I was in New York and talking with folks that had, I guess, protested after she was killed by New York Police Department. But she's somebody that literally wrote about being disabled and the fears that she had that she would be killed by police if she called for help. And that's exactly what happened to her. So like Deborah Danner is her name, Danner. You can like Google her. It'll pop up. She's somebody that lives with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Like a lot of Black folks will get the combination of schizophrenia, bipolar. And a lot of that has to do with the DSM, which is like the Bible for psychiatry, is not written for people that aren't white. Not written for people that aren't white and elite as well. So I just like want to center the conversation in that to say that some of the things I'm talking about seem like very theoretical, and they seem like, hey, just methods and ways in which like, you know, we carry out work, but it's something that is like life and death, really, like to actually implement some of the shit. Because when we're not like creating a culture of access, like we are deciding on whose lives matter, like in a legitimate way. And this is not something that is like uncommon. Just in Penn State, somebody was killed by the police after calling for help. Like right where I worked at in Wilkinsburg, right down the street, Bruce Kelly Jr. was killed by police. And these are some of like the more visible and I guess popularized ways in which people have been executed. But the folks that I work with in communities every day die in a methodical way due to lack of access, due to being able like pushed out of communities and into more inaccessible places where they're not able to get care, not able to have freedom of mobility. So it's not just like one disability type that we're talking about. It becomes multiple disabilities because it's exacerbated by the environment in which you're in. And I'll explain that a little bit. So I kind of want to talk about like what ableism is, how I think about it, how I'm understanding disability. From there, I'll go into like some of the practices of access through like a lens of disability justice and a little bit of the language that, you know, we can play with or attempt to mold to be more inclusive, like in how we're talking about things. And then I want to give like a quick overview of like what's happening in Pennsylvania. Um, yeah, so I guess I'll start with like a definition of ableism that we've been working on, which is an anti-black system. Like if you're to Google or look in a dictionary, you'll find that it'll probably say like ableism is the discrimination of people with disabilities, against people with disabilities. If it's radical, it'll say like the oppression of people with disabilities. Um, but the way that we're defining it, by we, it's a group of folks. I'm part of a Harriet Tubman collective. It's all Black, disabled, and deaf folks. Where we thought about this for a few years, at least collectively. But it says it's an anti-Black system that assigns value based on the ability to produce, profit, excel, and behave, and enforces a false idea of normalcy. Now, this is like a short definition. And the most important thing out of all of this is that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. Now, how that looks like, and since I'm thinking about police right now, like if you were, we've seen cases in which people have been killed by police that don't have disabilities, and in the aftermath of their deaths, they'll be talked about as being like subhuman or superhuman. Um, and this is like one of the ways in which like ableism is reinforced in order to justify the deaths of certain people. Now the history is like super important, the way that like disability and race has been pathologized. It's to understand that like our view on like what intelligence is, or our view of anything that is deviant from the standard, like white supremacist society or like dominant figure that we want to be, anything that is deviant from that can be considered disabled. So like in the DSM that I referred to earlier, queerness is something that was a mental illness, medically recognized as a mental illness until the 60s and 70s. To actually be running away from the plantation. So I'm talking about like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, people with diagnosed mental illnesses for wanting to be free, and or work stoppages. So like when we think about like what labor is, like work stoppage on a plantation would be something that you could be deemed to have a mental illness because of. Now this also like is perpetuated in like real time in real life. Like we just got done with one of the largest prison strikes in the history of the U.S. carceral system last year, and some of the people struck by doing work stoppages, and the treatment for that is solitary. Right now, what happens in prisons is when people become disabled, which if you're in a prison long enough, you will become disabled. If you develop certain types of disabilities, you go into solitary for your own protection. So there's like all of these connections that exist like with the carceral system. But I guess like the biggest thing that I like want us to take away from this short overview is that um, at like the height of institutionalization, the state schools, the hospitals, the asylums, in Pennsylvania, there's like 25, 26 of them across the state. These are places where literally your child is born with disabilities. The doctor says, okay, you won't be able to like raise this kid, send them to this place, which is a state, Penhurst, Somerset. Some of them are now prisons, like Somerset, a place where I go to often, the prison there. It started off as a poor farm, then it became an institution, now it's a prison. And then there's a prison across the street from that, Laurel Highlands. So there's like this deep history in Pennsylvania alone about the amount of institutions and state schools we had. And one of the reasons that we had so many is because we are right above the Mason-Dixon line, so people are running from freedom and being put into institutions. So that is like something that like it should not be lost on us. There are 6 of them that are still like operating right now in Pennsylvania, where disabled people are literally disappeared. And then the majority of them, if they haven't been converted into prisons, they are now places where people go like as haunted houses. Or they go take tours of them and they tell stories of these people, but they don't tell them in a way that honors it, right? It's not just about preserving a history so that we don't forget it happened. It's now entertainment and another way to profit off of even dead disabled bodies. And these are places that there's like extreme abuse and torture that happens. Like people are in cages, like literal chicken wire cages. Um, people died due to choking on meat that wasn't cooked. Like, so there's like all these things that I won't go into that, but this is important when it comes to the current things that disability communities are advocating for. Because one of those things that's like directly connected to that is like this idea of sheltered workshops, um, which is like the way that capitalism is set up here, at least in America, is that we have a federal minimum wage, and everybody is supposed to be paid above that minimum wage outside of uh, people that are deemed to be criminals. So like folks that are incarcerated, they can be paid sub minimum wage. Undocumented workers, or some type of care attendants that are not on papers or not paying taxes, right? So like a black market economy, so sex workers, like all of these other ways in which some of our communities are accustomed to making money. Um, and then the other one legally that you can be paid less than sub minimum wage is people with disabilities simply for the fact that you have a disability. The sheltered workshops exist all across the nation. The Department of Labor doesn't hide the statistics on it. They're called federal 14C contracts. Any organization that is set up to have a ticket for work program or any type of employment program. So they call them employment networks through the feds. So if you have like that 14C contract and an employment network, then you're able to pay people 2 cents per hour, 1 cent per hour. There's lawsuits in Ohio right now for paying people
So
1 cent per hour. Some of those places are Goodwills, they're Life Works, they're like downtown areas.
yeah, that's what I was about to
Choice.
ask.
Okay. Yeah, so Goodwill is like a long time like perpetrator of this. Like they have just in the past 5 years or so committed to de committed to like closing down the sheltered workshops. Um, Now 5 years is like this is a 40-year fight. So
Mm.
they stood for that long before they committed to like phasing out, and they're phasing out of the practice of that, but they're not uh like all of the traces of what a sheltered workshop looks like. Like these are places where people go, you count pencils, some people are producing profit in a way that capitalism would value for $25 an hour, right? But they're still being going to be paid just minimum wage. And they're also not cutting the ties and relationships with the other corporations that are not phasing out of this. So this is like all of this is like very complex, and I know like I don't want to minimize like the impact that it has on real people. I'm thinking about this in terms of Pittsburgh, where we have 4 schools in the public school system that are set up solely for disabled kids. They call them schools for students with exceptionalities. Um, yeah, students with exceptionalities is like a bullshit term too. Like no one knows where that came. Well, I don't know where it came from. It's like, but it's another way to soften it around disability. Like, um, typically, if you're to say like I have an entire institution set up for just disabled children, it lands a certain type of way, and like people might be more adept to question that. But with the language, they're able to soften it and make it seem like it's something that it's not. But these are literal like schools that it's all autistic children at one school. Some of them like some of the kids don't have language. Like there's 2 Kenyan kids that uh, didn't develop Swahili. They were nonverbal when they were in Kenya. They got to the U.S. And now are verbal, but literally don't have language. And the school just like pushes them through as janitors until they turn 21. And now they're like literally out in the world with like zero language, no English, no Swahili, no mother tongue, no sign. So all of that feeds into this system that we have. Fight against sheltered workshops, the fight against institutions are largely led by disabled parents or non-disabled parents of disabled children, typically white, typically um, upper caste or like of a higher income bracket. And they dominate the space around this. So this is why one of the reasons it's super important, like this concept of disability solidarity, of um, racial justice communities, economic justice communities, being in solidarity with disability communities, and vice versa, them being accountable to disability community for intersectional justice. Because the disability shit has happened in a silo for so long that it makes it to the point where like people even believe in like they just stand on the side of the oppressed generally. Um, that folks will listen to those type of groups that are within the disability community, because we don't have like an understanding or knowledge of it. Like one of the examples here is like Autism Speaks. This is like literally a hate group, like a organization that was founded and operated for decades on the premise that they are attempting to find a cure for autism. They are the largest and most heavily funded disability organization in the US. I think it might be the world. And like 50% of their funds go to research, another 30% go to fundraising, and like literally less than 2% go to direct service for autistic people. And their entire mission is to find a cure for autism, right? So, and autistic community has been very like I guess like I don't want to say vocal for lack of a better term, like vocal with the idea that like they like love being autistic, right? It's a part of their identity. So if you're to erase autism, you erase like the person as well. So this harkens back to eugenics and disabled people being the first people to be killed in the Holocaust. In the T4 program, it's about the forced sterilization of disabled people through prisons now. Still, that happens a lot with Black women in Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer did a lot of work around it. So I don't want to get like lost in the weeds there, but like all of these are things that like we should like really explore, and it's important to have that historical context to know exactly like what those flags are when we see them. Like some of the flags that I'll think about is like registries, and it's something that like at least folks like within the social justice realm have a little bit of language for, because of the resistance from Muslims after 9/11, right? And we know how dangerous registries can be. This is something that disabled communities have known forever, because our people have always been like the first people to be executed, the first people to experiment on, the first people to die in these situations. But abled people, and I use abled as like slang for the opposite of disabled. Some people like say able-bodied, like when talking about practicing disability justice, is important to not separate the body from the mind. So I see like the term able-bodied in itself to be an erasure of other disability types. So I would say just offer it as non-disabled or disabled. And also like that idea around like person first and identity first language. Like I want to honor where identity first language comes from, or person first language comes from. That's to say like people with disabilities, or a person with a disability, or a person with autism, and like all of these ways in which you like identify the human before you do the disability. There's like a history there, and there's a reason for that. But politically and socially, myself and a lot of other folks will identify as disabled. And it's okay to say that, right? Like, because disability justice, we're not viewing it as an impairment the same way that disability rights would. And that's like really heavy, like through a legal framework that's telling us that disability is an impairment and it's not just like a natural part of life. So yeah, I would offer that as well as language around that. But that history is like super important to understand and to know that like when disabled people are saying something, like those are things that we should listen to. And I guess like I'll go into a little bit about like some of like the current fights. Like so maybe one of the things that, and this is I'm talking when I'm saying disability community in general, like know that this is talking about a white-led, white dominant, white funded disability community. When I say that, almost every organization outside of like National Black Disability Coalition, they are all white-led, white-funded, white people, white-centric, and that's very important. But that's not to dismiss the work that they do, because it's also important too. So, like one of the things that happened was the we call them drive-by lawsuits for the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is the 28th year, I think, that law has been intact. That's an important civil rights legislation, just like in general. It's the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in the history of the world, probably. And it's anti-discrimination law for people with disabilities. But what it does is there's already a burden on disabled people in order to get accommodations through the ADA, meaning like if I use if I use a wheelchair and I'm going up to a business and the business got built within the past, 28 years and they don't have wheelchair access, that shit is illegal, but it's on me to bring a case to make sure that it's illegal. What we've seen is uh, Republicans attempt to chip away at this, at the ADA to take its teeth out of it. The last one was HR 620 was a bill. This was 2 years ago. The solidarity piece is like super important because it was the marginalized people within the disability community, the Black folks, the brown folks that were raising flags like 5-6 years ago to say like when the Disability Rights Bar Association is meeting up largely white folks to talk about this shit, that like we need to shut it down, right? And we physically shut it down and we're ostracized from it. And then 3 years later, after they've had enough meetings, they finally bring it to vote, and they turn it into legislation. But what that would have essentially done is, if you file a complaint, you have to come back 30 days later to see if the business had changed it. Then you can file a complaint. Then you would have to wait 60 days in order to see if they changed it. Then you go to court, and that litigation could take years, right? So it essentially takes the teeth out of it, and it places the burden on disabled people to get their own accommodation. Now I bring that up, even though like folks like fought it to the point where that didn't come. That like when that happened, like anybody these disability communities like almost did nothing, right? So it was on disabled people alone to fight for that. And we're not going to be able to survive that if it comes back next time, and it will come back. So these are like some of the important things just like to think about. Yeah, just around law in general. Another one is like the ACHA, the repeal. Like ADAPT is a group that has been around since like the early 1980s, started by 6-7 people that were in a nursing home in Denver. Like one of like the RAs like broke them out of the nursing home, and then like he set up like shop and had a house and shit. Like it's like this super dope history. But yeah, so ADAPT starts, and they start off fighting for public transportation. So like some of the activism history that gets erased when we talk about disability, almost all of it gets erased. It's like some of like the shit that we can learn from a lot, like especially when we're talking about direct action. But ADAPT, like they literally slept under public buses. And there's like problematic shit they did was like, yo, you could get on the bus, you can get to the back of the bus, we can't even get on the bus, right? So that shows like in a clear way how they weren't intersectional at the time too. And how they're not incorporating like Black people with disabilities into that. So there's that. But ADAPT is still like very relevant, and they have strong chapters in Philly. Bucks County has one. Like Northeast Pennsylvania has like a pretty good chapter, and Southwest Pennsylvania, so Washington, PA has a chapter. And I mentioned ADAPT because when the repeal for the ACHA was coming out, and that was the healthcare 2 years ago, yeah, 2 summers ago, we organized direct actions in 40-something states. And this is all by disabled people, led by disabled people. And these were all 40-something sit-ins of their senators' offices. And we went to DC 5 times that summer. And like you might have seen like images, people getting dragged out of like Mitch McConnell's office. But one of the things that's like using disability aesthetic to carry out direct action is super important too, because it's people in chairs. Like police don't know what the fuck to do with chairs. They don't know how to like, they break a lot of people's shit too, which is an issue, but they, by and large, they don't know what to do with chairs. They don't have accessible vans for it. So they can't take people to jail in the sense. So there's all these ways that being in solidarity like really helps a lot of us out. Like I even think in Pittsburgh this summer, a DAP member, Elisa, is like always rolling in the front of the actions when we're marching, and it helps like keep pace, and like that's the type of solidarity I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about like grandioso shit. It's like more so like on an access level, and how could we use each other's like privileges to like be in unison. So that is one. I guess another campaign would be, and this might be one of the most important, as far as like politically important, is the Disability Integration Act. This is federal legislation. But up until the early 2000s, Lois Curtis, somebody that if you haven't heard of her, like, you should Google. She has artwork. She lives in Atlanta. She also like a lot of like older Black disabled people struggle to pay bills and shit. So pay for her artwork. Like, yeah, like Lois is somebody that was a plaintiff in a case called Olmstead versus Curtis. But she grew up in a state hospital, a psychiatric institution. And I'm pausing as I say that. Like, I've been in institutions before, yeah, like I've been taken to institutions and forced to be there. And then I've also been there as like somebody that's helping people get out of institutions. And I just like, it carries a lot of weight, like the type of things that happen in institutions. And I like want to keep saying that because I think it's like easy for us to say, like, especially like folks that believe in abolition of prisons and jails, to say that we need mental health treatment and we need a place for people to go to. But I don't necessarily know that we understand to the full extent the history that has happened to disabled people and why disabled community can't get behind some of those efforts sometimes in talking about creating institutions for people to go to, whether they be in community or out of community. But that Olmstead decision in Lois's case was super important because up until that point, the early 2000s, if you were intellectually disabled, developmentally disabled, you do not have a right to live in community. So the Supreme Court ruled that you do have a right to live in community. The problem has been for the last 20 years that there is no law to enforce it. And I guess I should have prefaced this to say like the law is bullshit. I don't fuck with none of that. But as far as like a harm mitigation tool, it has like a real impact, and I can't dismiss that. And I have the privilege of saying like the law is bullshit if I don't need it to get me free right now too. So like, as a harm mitigation tool, the Disability Integration Act provides the teeth for that essentially. So if you're somebody that develops disabilities, if you have a serious injury, if you're at a place where you can't pay for healthcare and have attendant care service in your home, then right now you don't have an option. You just go to a nursing home, or you go to the street, or a lot of people died too. So there's like all these different ways. So like, you don't have the option. That's important too. We have to like expand like how we view carceral systems. It's not just like prisons and jails, detention centers, or kid jails. It's also nursing homes. It's also like the state hospitals and schools and institutions. It's also the psychiatric institutions. But nursing homes is a place that, and also like as an organizing base, this is literally the third biggest voting block in Pennsylvania, the population of people in nursing homes, right? Like, you got Philly, you got Pittsburgh, and then you got nursing homes. So it's a huge population that's like largely untapped. And it's also like where a lot of voter suppression happened. Like, it became visibly clear. Like, I was down in Georgia a lot last year before Stacey Abrams' election, and we were working a lot like with folks organizing people in nursing homes to go vote. And there was like real fucking resistance there. Like, they did a lot of shit for churches, for nursing homes. They changed the days in which you could vote. They changed like the methods in which, like, some of the nursing homes, all of them are private. They're shuttling people to the polls. There's like all of this fucked up shit that happens, and like we've seen some of that same resistance in Pennsylvania. So I just like throw that out there as like a place to like maybe think about. But right now, if you don't get the option to live in community, you go to a nursing home, the DIA essentially erases that and gives people an option to get care in their home. So yeah, I would say that those are the biggest things. Mm-hmm. Outside of that, like, Jordan, is there anything else that like we discussed that is like pertinent for me to cover? Or I'm cool with questions too, so.
Yeah, take some questions. We have some things happening in the chat. Also, I'll be like linking in resources from the workshop, like Dustin, the Access is Love page. Reach out to ADAPT. That's one point. We should reach out to ADAPT because we got Bucks County people. But yeah, we have a question from Lieko. Leah Gold said, do you have any resources and books that you can recommend to gain more knowledge and learn more about the intersectionalities between Blackness and disabilities? Dustin, I know you have like your website that has like the library. Talk about that briefly. And if you have a link,
Yeah.
I'll try to find it.
You say your name is like Rieko? Is that like Reiko? I think I'll follow you on Instagram. Your page is super dope. But
Thank you. It's actually pronounced Lieko because it's Japanese.
Lieko?
Yeah, the R sounds like an L, but yeah, it's Lieko. And thank you.
Okay, cool. Is that Japanese? That name?
Yeah.
Okay, my friend Leah, her name is spelled R-E, but anyway, your page is dope. I follow you already.
I appreciate it. Dope. Thank you.
So there's like we did it for Braddock, really. Like Braddock is like a suburb of Pittsburgh. Some folks might know it where Antoine was killed. For the library, we built a collection, and it's like me and like a person that works at the library, Dana. That shit is like on my website. It's a collection of 40 books, and there's context like behind the book. So like we wrote an article about it to like say why it was important, where it existed, how it existed. And then also my website, there's like a tree moss section where it has like all of these places like where I'm deriving information from. And then I would say another place is like the Harriet Tubman Collective. We have like writings on Tumblr. We have a Twitter that you'll probably be able to pick up on like a lot of hashtags to get information. And then one of my comrades, Talila Lewis, that's Talila Lewis, Lewis. If you Google TL's name, their website pops up, and they have a bunch of writings too. And the website is not all writings either. Some of it is like videos and like songs and other ways of learning.
And what is the website exactly?
Dustin. So my name, Dustin P as in Paul Gibson .com.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So I want to read off. Thank you. Diego is super dope. I'm gonna link this in the chat as well, and I want to like condense a couple questions if possible. So for one, questions. Basically like talking about talking about acceptance day in the local schools, and bullying around disabilities, and how to go about that type of advocacy around like acceptance days and disabilities and bullying. And then there is sorority doing Autism Speaks. So it's like, how do you bring up the problematic nature of that organization? So those are two.
Okay, and I can touch on those like kind of quickly because they're somewhat related. So this is April, it was like Autism Awareness Month, and that's like largely driven by like the same people I was talking about earlier that dominate that conversation, along with Autism Speaks. So you'll see like the blue puzzle pieces and shit like that, and they'll light shit up blue, all of which like the autistic community rejects. So it has transitioned to a point where folks say they want Autism Acceptance Month to transform it to that. And instead of like me talk, I would rather say just go to Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So I think it's ASAN is the acronym, but Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. It is led by autistic people. They do like a lot of policy work, and they have like published like a shit ton of resources about like Autism Speaks and like why that shit is problematic. And they will link you to videos of like other autistic people that have their own stories about like Autism Speaks and like some of the practices that they've like championed over the years. But they have a bunch. So I would say just like go to their website and look through that.
Word, I'll link it. Oh, sorry. I misinterpreted that question. It was not so much about bullying, but more like how the schools themselves treat disabled kids. Thank you for clarifying that for me. And then the last question was from Suja. How can I, as a disabled brown person, advocate for disability justice?
Okay. So the first one, like, I think, like, it's hard for me to think of outside this, like, think about this like outside of a theoretical frame. But I'm transitioning to like develop language around talking about schools as places that are necessary components of a prison industrial complex, rather than just like a place that can be a launching pad for a pipeline. So the way that prison exists and why that shit exists is why like the politics look like they do in schools. Like the segregation of disabled students, the misdiagnosis, the underdiagnosis of disabled kids of the global majority, or Black kids in particular. Like all of that shit like feeds into the system that is like carcerality, right? So that's like a difficult question like to ask, like how do we treat them? Like on college campuses, one, like a big thing with colleges is like access, physical access. And it's also access in the sense of like laptop bans and shit like that, or like professors that pride themselves in being rigorous. And like, so a lot of the things that like I see people like already resist on college campuses, like there's a disability component to that. And a lot of the times it's like really centered in undoing ableism. So I would say the biggest thing is like that education process to name that what it is. Like, because when you're fighting against like a system that is like, hey, we have to produce this much and our value is attached to that. And if we don't, then we are somehow less than, like that shit is ableism. So we have to be able to like name that. And that way we can like build community and solidarity with people. And then like shit that's like happened in Edinburgh, like that program, like I'm not sure if like folks like know what I'm talking about, but that program is like one of the flagship in the nation, right? And that's like really sad to think about it that way, because it's like the bare minimum. So for them to take it away, like that shit, like I'm not sure what else to do outside of that, but except like direct action with like demands tied to it. It's already past the point of, you know, doing the pitchfork advocacy approaches and like all of the behind the scenes work. Like I think that people need to show up in a visible way for students on campus that are being treated a certain way, namely due to like ableism, right? Like I find it like really important in the way in which disability communities have used what they would call allies in the past, caretakers, personal attendants, like all of, yeah. So I would just say that. And then as far as like advocating for yourself as a disabled person, like one, like we advocate for like ourselves like all the time, right? Like, and that starts like at a very young age when we say we don't like something or we do like something. So I think like that process has like been really difficult for me to just like be comfortable with naming the shit that I need, like when I need it. And yeah, that's like an ongoing journey for me too. So I would say that's one. But then also on the flip side of that, and this might be like an in-community type conversation, so I'm cool with having that offline, but it doesn't help when like people are just like, yo, we want to include disabled people, and they do include disabled people and they don't have any fucking analysis. Then it's like, this is how we get Clarence Thomas and like other like tokenizing of diversity and shit. Like that's the diversity and inclusion model. So I would say developing analysis is like one of the best ways to advocate. And that's like being in community with other people. Like I'm always down with like connecting folks with other people, because that's how I learned. Never went to school or anything like that. So like I'm cool with that. And also like reading if that's your shit. If not, like we built a playlist, Disability Solidarity. It's all Black artists talking about disability without naming disability. There's people I listen to like Boosie. Boosie is a little problematic at the moment, but like Boosie, J. Cole, like all these other people that like are ways to learn essentially.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks for your questions, everyone. I hope we got to reach some of them. Do check in the, yeah, thank you. do check in the chat. We have like some references to things that you pointed out, Dustin. ASIN, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, HR 620, about like filing complaints and how like ridiculous and tedious they intentionally make that. ACHA, and the Disability Integration Act. Those are things that we're gonna have to like really be looking into, be accountable for. Also, like we're gonna reach out to ADAPT. Linked also is a collection of books like that Dustin and the crew put together about Blackness and disabilities. And a really good reference with a bunch of toolkits around like being an ally. Yeah. So yeah, there's a book collection, the toolkits. They're really great for reading and taking notes on and activating on. So I'm gonna throw it to Kamaya to wrap this up.